Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful morning here in the Caribbean. I hope it is wherever you are. I'd like to welcome everyone to this very important and special session. We are launching our report, a legislative review of freedom of information and access to information in our region. And I think that this is a topic that has been on everybody's minds for quite a while now. And we've been talking about it here at MIC for a very, very long time. And that is because we have seen a lot of challenges with this issue when we try to file for requests in our region. I've had many journalists say that they've even given up, some of them. And so we need to continue along to try to find ways to work through those obstacles so that we can bring the facts in the best possible way to everyone whose interest it is, and that is in the public interest. This project would not have been possible without the support of the FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, through UKAID, and I would like to thank them sincerely for being able to partner on this with us and for supporting this project from the time we did all of the groundwork with regards to the issues we were having in the region, when we did our panel discussions, which was just over a year ago, January 2023 to be exact, to helping with our help desk, which has been used by a few journalists in the region. We have had to constantly work at this to get to this point where we are today. And so having said all of that, I would like to recognize the presence of the British High Commissioner to Belize, Ms. Nicole Davison, and she is here with us, and I would like to ask her to bring opening remarks.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. So first of all, let me apologise for the optics. There's always one person who has some IT issues, and today that's me, so I'm joining you from my phone. But it gives me great pleasure to join you today. It is in fact a beautiful day here in Belize as well, so we're keeping up that wonderful Caribbean trend. But without further ado, it does give me great pleasure to address you this morning at the opening of this launch event. I would like to thank the Media Institute of the Caribbean for their invitation to say a few words and for their continued partnership with us over the years. For over 3 years now, the UK has been working with them to support journalism and media across the Caribbean. And most recently, this has involved UK support for MIC's annual investigative fellowship, which started last week with a very engaging week of training in Jamaica. Our partnership has gone from strength to strength over the years, and we are continually impressed by their passion, dedication, and commitment to improving regional collaboration. As we look ahead to World Press Freedom Day on Friday, the issue of access to information is particularly timely. The UK is a proud champion of a strong media globally, and in September last year, in collaboration with UNESCO, we held a global conference to celebrate the International Day for Universal Access to Information and to highlight the importance of this issue. At this conference, it was agreed that the free flow of and access to information is a vital means to support an international community that upholds stability, security, rule of law, prosperity, and promotes sustainable development. It is also crucial to the democratic process, including enabling institutions to discharge their commitments to individuals and communities, which can deepen inclusion and strengthen accountability. For the media, the issue is of particular importance. Without access to information, the media's ability to provide transparent, insightful, and trustworthy information on matters of key importance is really undermined. Whilst the independent media has an important role to play in supporting a democracy to thrive, it cannot fulfil this function in isolation. It relies on governments and wider civil society to create the right facilitating environment and legislative framework. The UK is supporting this and has provided over £600 million in overseas development assistance to media and the free flow of information in the past 5 years. This has included support to the BBC World Service, a powerful voice internationally recognised in independent and impartial broadcasting, which is operationally independent of the UK government. And I think that's a really important point, that independence point. It has also included journalist training and support to media organisations to help them become more financially resilient in difficult times. In the Caribbean, our work has primarily been in partnership with MIC and has focused on many different areas, including an access to information project that has been running for the last year or so. That report is being launched today on FOI and ATI legislation across the region and is the culmination of this project. I really look forward to hearing more during this session. As the report acknowledges, most English-speaking Caribbean countries have relevant legislation, and there is some good practice across the region, and this is definitely to be welcomed and celebrated. But not all countries do have this, and there's scope for improvements in the legislation and implementation for those that do. This is clearly demonstrated by some of the findings from the survey MIC conducted on the issue, such as the fact that 86% of respondents reporting cases do not receive any response to their feedback, to their request. And relatedly, many journalists are not filing requests based on frustration of experiences or a lack of clarity and confidence on how to use the legislation. So this report helpfully provides detailed analysis of these issues and practical recommendations for improvements. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this in today's session. And I hope that there's genuine interest in most countries in taking forward these recommendations. And I know MIC stands ready to support countries that do want to do that. And again, I really commend your work on this and dedication to this extremely important issue. Looking forward to a fantastic session, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I think that you've really put everything there in a nutshell that we are trying to get at with this project. And I want to thank UKAID again for your support, not just of this project, but you have been very helpful to MIC, very supportive, even with our investigative journalism fellowship that we did in Jamaica last week. So again, thank you on behalf of MIC and the region's journalists who you are supporting.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so folks, we're about to get to the meat of the matter here. Very important topic. You all will be getting a link to the report, which is going to be up on the MIC website. This is your sneak peek of it. And this is what the report looks like. It's very detailed. And it took, I think, just over 6 months for us to really get this done. And it will serve as notes on where the legislation should be or can be improved. And Dion is going to give us some insight on that. But I would like to thank all of our panelists in advance for making the time for this. I know that this is an issue that is very, very near and dear to you. And I know that we've had many discussions, all of us at one time or the other, about the significance of having access to information and easy access to information in our region. So folks, I would like to start by again welcoming everyone, reminding you about a few house notes as we get started. If you have questions, please place them in the chat. I will be taking those and ensuring that our panelists respond to them. Secondly, if you fall off of the call, please rejoin using the same link. Thirdly, please keep your cameras and microphones off. It's very distracting when we're in a panel discussion, and the tendency is it will stay on if you drop off and come back in. So please pay attention so that this morning can go smoothly for all of us participating. Dion Jackson Miller, who has been an advocate for ATI and FOI for so many years, who came to me with this idea years ago. And I decided it was important for us to pursue it. So Dion, I wanted to start by, allowing you to put this report into perspective and give us the highlights of the report, because you led the team who reviewed it. So I hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Kieran. And just to say, I do see one of my other team members in the room with us as well. So thanks so much for joining us as well, Jeffrey. So the whole idea, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the legislative review that we did, but there were some associated projects associated activities that went along with the review that I'm going to just touch on briefly as well, so you have an overview of exactly what it is we're doing. And I know many of you, I've looked at the names in the room, so it's you know, a who's who in the access to information world across the region. But nevertheless, you know, I always like to just go through the basics even very quickly. Freedom of information or access to information, the various statutes use, some of the statutes use one term, some use the other. This is really the right to seek, receive, and impart information that is held by public bodies. And one of the things Her Excellency mentioned, and you'll see it a little bit further as well, and I'm sure you'll hear it in the room in terms of the frustration that a lot of people have because the laws don't always work as smoothly as they should, but they do work. There are instances of them working.
Access to information changes people's lives. With the Sustainable Development Goals, all governments have agreed to ensure public access to information for all by 2030. People can use this universal right to improve their lives. Margaret is one example among many. There was a shortage of malaria medicines in her community. She used her legal right to ask for information on how many supplies the local health centre had received. The records were released and suggested that supplies were being stolen. The centre's management improved and enough medicine became available. Around the world, many people still cannot exercise their universal right to information.
And in fact, that pertains in the Caribbean as well, because not all our countries still have access to information laws. Closer to home, this was a recent example of an ATI request that had been made by the Jamaica Environment Trust. I see Teresa Rodriguez Moody in the room as well, and her organization, as I said, the Jamaica Environment Trust, has over the years done a lot of work using access to information. They are, I would say, certainly one of the foremost civil society groups making use of the Act. And across the Caribbean, we see legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, in Belize, Jamaica, of course, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, interestingly, enacted the legislation, but has never brought it into effect. Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, St. Kitts and Nevis, Ghana. Ghana is a special case we'll touch on in a moment. I see my colleague Nazima in the room. I know Nazima has a lot to say about how ATI works or doesn't work in Ghana and the Cayman Islands. And there are a number of our Caribbean countries that interestingly drafted laws, but never brought them into effect, never enacted them: St. Lucia, Barbados, and Grenada. So one of the activities that we did was the development of what we call an advocacy toolkit. This is for the countries that don't have legislation yet and are interested in lobbying for it, but perhaps don't quite know where to start. And it's really just add water and stir. We have included an op-ed on freedom of information, access to information that anyone can just take, add, subtract, customize it to your use in your particular country and use it absolutely without attribution. That's fine. We go through the various steps that you should undertake in lobbying. We've developed templates of letters, for instance, that you can write to different interest groups, parliamentarians, other civil society groups you're trying to partner with, business sectors, media groups, and so on. Talking points for interviews on ATI and suggested partners across the region. So this is something that's going to be permanently available. Anybody who is interested, please, it's on the MIC website. Kieran can give you more information on where to access that information. She also mentioned the help desk. Now, the whole idea of this is that whenever we do training, one of the things we hear from journalists is that they're not quite sure how to use the legislation. So we set up a help desk so anybody could just write in and say, hey, I'm making this particular request. I'm not sure how to go about it. And then we'd look at the legislation in your region and walk you through the process. this was a little bit disappointing in that we really didn't get as many requests as we thought we would. What we did figure out, though, when we looked closer at the survey that Her Excellency mentioned, and that I'll touch on very, very briefly as well, is that, well, a lot of people aren't using the laws. So if you're not using the laws, then you won't need help in how to use it. And what we did find as well, though, is that I had done a webinar, seeing that we weren't getting a lot of take-up. I'd actually done a complimentary webinar for the Jamaican journalists, just to say, hey, let me walk you through how to use this. Immediately following that webinar, we got a set of requests. So what I think we could do is find a way to twin perhaps a limited period of help to our training seminars or any kind of awareness raising activities, because what appears to happen is that, you know, when you talk to people, when you walk them through it, when you give them examples, people get fired up and, hey, I want to use it, but sometimes they don't have the information. So I think that is something we could look at going forward. This is a snippet of a video from the Jamaica Accountability Meetup portal headed by Jeanette Calder, who you'll hear from in just a moment.
I know you have enough questions about how government are run or not run, so let me show you how it works. Say mosquito spraying going on in the community, your children asthmatic and you want to know what chemicals are in it. Or what about that Auditor General report and a public official getting twice his salary with no proper approval? Is your taxes and you want to know if they paid it back? First, do some basic searching to see what is already on government websites. If you don't see what you're looking for, make a formal ATI request by completing the application form on the ATI site or sending a letter or email. And remember, you don't have to say why you need it. It is your right to know. Make sure you send your request to the right agency, and once they confirm receipt, they get 30 calendar days to provide the information. A maximum of 60 if extra time is needed.
Okay, so you have a process, you have laws, and yet we're still not seeing people use it. Why not? Well, the survey that we conducted, again, as part of this overall project, 34% of journalists said they had experienced refusals when they made access to information requests. Over 80%, they're saying they just got no response at all. Put in the application, nobody now answer them, not a yes, not a no, not a refusal, just into the void. 49% said they would get a refusal, but with no clear explanation for the refusal. And 56% said, boy, waste of time, don't think it's going to make much difference. Some people use back channels in trying to get the official information. Other people just give up entirely. 6% of journalists said they haven't made requests because they didn't have the resources. Now, clearly to me, this speaks to, again, ignorance of the law itself, because there are literally no resources required other than writing a letter or an email, or if you want to make a verbal request, which I must say I generally do not recommend. 76% have said they wanted to file a request but didn't for various reasons. One of those reasons, 9%, said they just didn't know how to use the legislation. So again, across the region, we're seeing limited use of the legislation, even where it exists. We're hearing frustration with how it works. And as well, we are just seeing journalists saying it's just not working. Now, because MIC is very aware of these ongoing problems with freedom of information and access to information, one of the things we did at the beginning of this project was a series of 4 webinars exposing people to different issues involving access to information. So the first one was on general understanding of the laws across the region. We did a whole workshop on how to use the law, how to draft a request, how to track them, how to follow them, what happens if it is you're refused, which happens all the time. This is not a Jamaican problem. This is not a Caribbean problem. People who use access to information legislation all across the world will tell you that refusals are common, even when the refusal has no basis in law. And part of that, of course, is that our governments have a culture of hanging on to information and saying no. And we know there are some political issues as well, especially when you're asking for certain types of information that governments feel might embarrass them. So we did a session on that. We did a session on human rights perspectives across the world, which was really interesting, as well as looking at the way forward, things, as we said, like what the work that MIC is doing, advocacy, and what we want to see. Now, coming to this specific legislative review now, the idea was to identify some of the issues that needed remedying, also to look at best practices, to make recommendations for individual statutes, the Jamaican Act, the Trinidad and Tobago Act, and so on, as well as some general recommendations for the region. We also wanted to jumpstart the effort of trying to amend and improve the ATI laws. And again, I have to say here, it's really important, I think, that we don't give up easily because the Jamaican legislation, for instance, came into effect in 2002, and there's a provision in the law that it was supposed to be reviewed. The first review to take place within a year of enactment. It was a little bit late, but the review took place. Recommendations were made in 2011, and there the process stopped. Not one has been included in the law in terms of improving it, but the advocacy has been very consistent over the years. And I think it's just really important for those of us involved in advocacy as well as involved in journalism to know, say, it not go easy. It's not an easy road, as Buju Banton says. You have to push, you're going to get resistance. That's just the nature of the job, and we can't give up, And during the Q&A, I'd love to hear more from you guys about, whether it is you're fed up and what keeps you going. So how did we make our recommendations? We looked at two source documents. One was the Article 19. Article 19, I think most of you know, but it's an international advocacy group that advocates for freedom of expression. And the right to information, RTI, is a big part of what they do. And they've developed a series of principles for best practices around the right to information. So we looked at that and drew on that for our recommendations. And then for specific legislative examples, we looked to the Inter-American Model Law 2.0 on the right to the right to access public information. And this was very recently revised in 2020. It's very extensive. It's available online as well. All of these, of course, that you can go and look at for yourself. Just briefly, the Article 19 principles. So again, where we're coming from. Maximum disclosure is one of them. And this is a presumption that all information that's held by public bodies should be subject to disclosure. So the idea is that you start with the principle of maximum disclosure, and only then do you look at whether or not the access needs to be restricted. And as many of us I know have experienced, our government seems to start from the opposite. Many agencies seem to start from the perspective of, let's hold on to information and you have to give us a reason to let it go. So maximum disclosure, really important principle. Obligation to publish, that we shouldn't only be asking for information. There's a lot of information that governments have that they should be proactively publishing. This is aligned to the principle of open government, that, government should be should be open to our scrutiny. We should be able to watch to see what is done. We should be able to go to meetings to observe things that are going on. Limited scope of exceptions, another big issue, and this is one common problem across the region. The exemptions regime, these are the regimes that say, these are the documents you can't get, are inevitably far too broad, and it goes against Principle 4, that the exceptions should be limited. Principle 5, processes to facilitate access. Again, this means that if you're asking for a document, it should be easy. There shouldn't be roadblocks in your way. There shouldn't be obstacles that are thrown up. Cost, there should be no fee to access documents. Most of the legislation that exists across the region, most of it does fall in line with this, that any cost should be just, if you want a photocopy, you pay the cost of the photocopy, and even that shouldn't be exorbitant. Again, open meetings, that if parish council is meeting, parliament is meeting, committees of parliament are meeting, we should be able to go and sit down and watch them, or as is now the case, watch televised sittings of those meetings. Principle 8 is that disclosure takes precedence. So if there are any laws that are in existence that are incompatible with the idea of disclosing information, those laws need to be repealed or amended. And principle 9 is that there should be protection provided for whistleblowers. And the quick comment on the Inter-American Model Law 2.1, access to public information, as I mentioned, recently revised in 2020. And the whole idea is that it is promulgating standards that will give citizens across the hemisphere greater access and greater guarantee to their rights. Having said that, the project team took a flexible approach to the recommendations. We're very cognizant of the fact that we're in an area of very small states which have limited resources, a pressing legislative agenda in many cases, and not many people to do the drafting, to do the work that's necessary. So we did not adopt the Inter-American law wholesale. We looked through, we picked out what we thought were the most important provisions, especially those in line with those important principles of Article 19, and recommended changes only when necessary. As I mentioned, the Jamaican law still hasn't been amended. And that is the case, I think, with most, not all, most legislation across the region. So we don't want to try to create a burden in terms of recommended approaches to amendment, but at the same time, we do think that where the law isn't working or where there are pressing issues that need to be resolved, that those should be changed, and we made our recommendations in line with that idea. So generally speaking, what we recommended for individual laws were, specific provisions that we believe would improve those statutes. Having gone through the Ghanese legislation, we believe that this is the, let me pull from my rarely used diplomacy and say, I believe this is the least effective law that has been enacted across the region. We believe that there are so many issues with it that it in fact needs fundamental reform. We're suggesting that there isn't a piecemeal approach to try and patch this up, that the entire law be repealed. Discussions take place and it be reenacted. And I probably should say a word of apology to Nazima, who has said in seminar after seminar, Dion, the law doesn't work. We can't use it. We can't bother use it. And I know I keep saying, you have to push, you have to test the law. I still think that if for no other reason than to have data, so, to be able to say we made 100 requests and nobody paid us any mind in all 100, I think that's far more effective in a lobbying position than simply to say nobody no pay with a mind, But having looked closely and gone through the legislation, the team agreed that our recommendation for this law would be that it needs fundamental reform. And I'm not going into the statutes of the individual territories. Here, I'm just going to make some general recommendations. I would just say in relation to Ghana, just to give you an example, for instance, there is no provision for information officers in different ministries or departments. There is one central information commissioner for the entire Ghana. And all the requests are supposed to go to this one person who is then supposed to field them. And I see Jeanette's face like, what? And basically, Jeanette, nothing happens. And I'm not going to say anything more because I would ask Nazima perhaps if anybody is interested to tell us a little bit more about how it doesn't work. It also, because the information commissioner is a be all and end all, there is no internal appeal. So any kind of appeals would have to go then straight to the High Court. So it's a very, I don't know where the template came from for that, because I'm not seeing anything like that when I look at laws across the world, but it's been over 10 years. So we would strongly recommend that this one be appealed. All right, these are some, I'm just going to go briefly through some general principles that were recommended should be included in all statutes across the region, all the laws. The presumption of maximum disclosure, I don't think we saw this in one statute. And again, it's really important, especially I think in helping civil servants to make the leap from thinking of information as belonging to them and hugging it up, and understanding that no, the information belongs to us, to the public. You're holding it in trust for us. And the presumption, therefore, should be, if I ask for it, I can get it. And I think enacting this in the Freedom of Information or Access to Information statute could help with that. Scope of the law means who it applies to. Generally speaking, you know, we're talking about public information. So generally speaking, the laws apply to the public agencies, departments, ministries, and so on. The various statutes use different kind of devices to expand it. So it may say, for instance, that a minister can take by affirmative resolution in Parliament, have the law apply to a particular private sector agency that perhaps has public functions. We think this is clumsy, it's time wasting, and we like the provision in the Inter-American Model Law, which says that the law should apply to private agencies, political parties, union, NGOs, and so on, if it is they receive public funding and if they carry out public functions. Because in other words, once you accept taxpayers' money, and I want to know how you're using that money, you should be able to tell me. So that's one recommendation we're making. Most laws across the region say that you don't have to say why you make a request, but not all. So we're recommending that any of the statutes that don't have this provision need to include it. Active transparency is a big issue, pushing out information, not just waiting for people to come and ask. Again, I think all of the laws have some provision for active transparency that says, you know, this particular category of information should be published by the various entities, but those categories tend to be pretty limited. They deal with things like the hierarchical structure of the organization, for instance, addresses and so on. And we think there is, again, in line with the Inter-American Model Law, there's a lot of other information that should be just routinely pushed out because it's prepared. Things like budgets, things like work plans. Why should I have to ask you for that? You make a budget for how you're using taxpayers' money. Just put it on your website, you know. Let's all save some time and let's have more proactive dissemination of information. So our recommendation is that for those areas of the law, that the categories of information to be proactively disclosed should be expanded, and we can look to the Inter-American Model Law for ideas there. Previously disclosed information. I don't think I saw any law in the region that has this particular provision, which I thought was so practical and so makes so much sense. In other words, it says if somebody has already asked for the information, then it should be, you should just disclose it. Why are you putting other people through the same thing? And if somebody else requests it, just put it on your website. So once it's been requested, it's been reviewed, it is clear that this is something that can be disclosed, just disclose it. Don't make other people have to come behind and be asking the same thing. Application processes are another thing. Most laws do allow application for information through a variety of means, email, letter, verbally, and so on, but not all. So some of them are narrow. So in other words, some of them say you have to apply in writing, for instance. And as we know, we do have levels of illiteracy in the region, and we therefore think that we do need to allow applications by a wide variety of means. If it is that somebody is making a verbal application, then of course there would have to be a duty on the public servant to reduce that application to writing. Again, some of the laws have this, most I would say, but not all. A public interest test is something we see in a few of the laws. Trinidad and Tobago has it, St. Vincent, which is in effect, has it. I think interestingly, Ghana actually has a public interest test, but not all. And again, a public interest test is really important because again, it goes to the point of maximum disclosure. When you have a public interest test, then there are no blanket refusals. You can't just say, oh, this particular document falls under an exempt category, you can't get it, even though there's absolutely nothing sensitive about the particular document. So the whole idea is that it forces decision-making on a case-by-case basis, which is much more, as I said, in keeping with the principle of maximum disclosure. And the question that the public servants have to ask is, let me look at the public interest. How is the public interest best served? Is the public interest best served by disclosing the information rather than withholding it, in which case the document should be disclosed even if it falls into an exempt category? The maximum duration of the period to withhold information. So you're always going to have laws, the laws saying, you know, particularly sensitive bits of information can't be disclosed. Maybe we can't disclose them for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, what have you. No, across the region, it varies. So we see 20 years, we see 30 years. Our recommendation is that it shouldn't exceed 20 years. We're not saying that it should be there, but it shouldn't be exceeding 20 years. The Inter-American law is actually, the model law is much lower than this. It says 5 years, and under certain circumstances, an extension of an additional 5 to 10. We didn't go there because we think that's going to be a really hard sell in the region. So we thought our initial recommendation at this stage, because I think incremental progress is also a thing. Let's start with saying let's not exceed 20 years. This also I found interesting in the model law, and we're recommending it be introduced into our legislation. We don't have this in the region. The whole idea that you can't just come and say, okay, I couldn't find this, you know, it doesn't exist. No, you have to prove it. Go and search and document the search, and then show us how you've documented the search. You know, we search the archives of the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Sport, the libraries, the back room, the this, the that. It makes it harder for public servants then to just be kind of flippant in the response and say we couldn't find that it doesn't exist. And we saw this come into play recently in the Armadale appeal in Jamaica, where information was being requested, and you know the tribunal really was very strong on saying that this information has to be found. You can't just go out there and say it doesn't exist. We think it should be in the statute. This, very important, doesn't exist in all the statutes, the deemed refusal, because again, remember we heard a lot of the journalists saying people just aren't answering them, and at that point, many of them give up. If you have in the provision, the law, that a failure to respond is deemed to be a refusal, then what that does is the applicant can then move on to the next step of appeal, whether it's to an ombudsman or a tribunal or a court. And it prevents the public servants from stopping your process by just ignoring you. So you can leapfrog over the person who is ignoring you once the time limits have passed. Right to appeal, again, all the statutes sure have a right to appeal, but not all of them have an internal process and an external process. And we believe there should be an internal and an external process, and that the external process also should be separate from the court itself, because a whole heap of people can't afford to go to court. You need a very simple, cheap, cost-effective solution that people can just write a letter or fill in a simple form, and somebody who will act as a backstop to see whether or not the document in fact should have been refused. This is becoming increasingly important. And again, we don't see this in our legislation. Again, this is the importance of updating legislation based on the fact that technology keeps moving. A lot of people complain that they'll get information, they'll get data, and it's sent to them in forms that they can't manipulate, they can't use, they can't crunch the numbers. And we're therefore recommending, again, this adoption from the model law, that it be made mandatory in law that information is increasingly disclosed in an open data format that can be manipulated and can be crunched and can be edited. And the phrase there, increasingly disclosed, does speak to the fact that we know that everything can't happen all at once. So again, step-by-step approaches, but you need to show that you're starting to do this. Just a couple of general recommendations, again, coming in from the concerns. We think it's untenable that in 2024, you have public entities or departments that don't have a website. Come on. This is something now that should be de rigueur. It should be something that's mandatory. They should maintain and update their websites so that the public has a very easy way of getting the information that's proactively disclosed, for instance. Also, that yes, it should be a part of the law that public officials be trained in the use of freedom of information, access to information. As somebody who helps people who are making ATI requests, I can tell you a lot of these public officials don't know squat about the law. They write it, they tell you all kind of nonsense, and then you write back and you say, look, Section 3.5 says this, so please stop the nonsense and do what you're supposed to do. So apart from all the training we're giving to journalists and civil society, the officers themselves need to be trained on an ongoing basis. So we are saying it needs to be put in the law, but then the training also has to take place. Because, you know, we love putting stuff in legislation and then nothing ever happens. So this is something, whether it's once a year, because we do, of course, have turnover of staff, and we do have to keep that process going. So in terms of next steps, we've been talking about a model law for the Caribbean itself, given our kind of issues and idiosyncrasies. I know that I should say the team was going back and forth about it a little bit because of the experiences that some team members have had, where we do know that legislative drafters in different countries really like to do their own thing. You know, they don't want to feel that anything is being imposed on them. But in terms of just saying, hey, this is information that's available, you can draw on, you don't have to adopt it hook, line, and sinker. You can see how this works for you, but at least it's a start if a country is going in that direction. Advocacy to enact laws where they currently don't exist. This has been going on, needs to continue. The Association of Caribbean Media Workers has been, you know, very, very vocal on this over the years, and various press associations absolutely need to continue with that as well as continue with advocacy for greater use of the laws themselves and to improve the laws that do exist. Let me just say very quickly on this that one of the things I've heard from people who are experienced in this area is that you kind of have to watch the amendment thing, because sometimes governments use the space for amendment to introduce further restrictions. So there is a significant body of people who actually feel that, you know, we have something in place, leave it alone. And this is something we've actually seen. We've seen in, for instance, countries like Ireland, where governments then went in and went in and imposed restrictions, making information harder to get. We've seen it tried here in Jamaica when the government tried to extend the period for which cabinet documents would be exempt from disclosure, and it was thanks to the significant outcry from civil society, the public and the media community, that they backed off. So I do think this is something we do have to be very, very careful about, because it is so easy, if you're not paying strict, careful attention, for all kinds of little provisions to be slipped into the law that you're not aware of until you try to use it. And just ending for you with a quote. This is supposed to be one of the early philosophers. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy is when adults are afraid of the light. And you might call this a little bit of a theme song for access to information.
Knowledge is power. Example is better than precept. Knowledge is power. Example is better than precept.
All right, there you go. That is the Thessalonians, I think. I'll double check their name in just a moment, which has slipped me. But there you go. Kieran, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dion. What a bonus there that we have a theme song now for the project. That's really great. So folks, I think Dion has done a really fantastic job at giving us an overview. And I hope you all realize that it's very important as journalists and civil society to ensure that we keep pushing this and that we keep letting the public know in as many ways as we can. But Dion, I just want to, ask you one thing because you went through this whole process and I know it took a lot of time and energy, but you would have seen the challenging issues. So I'm asking you, for us in this region, knowing how many countries also do not have the legislation, what do you think is the most challenging issue we're facing?
I would say there are two things. One is the breadth of the exemptions, because the exemptions in areas like the economy and national security, governments tend to sweep almost everything under those two exemptions. If you're trying to get information, and Jet, I'm sure, and Jeanette can tell you, on things like major contracts, they're quick to claim economic exemptions, or anything to do with, obviously, crime fighting, anything like that, they push under national security, even when it's not a document that should be exempted. So I would say the breadth of the exemption is one, and the other is continuing to fight a culture of secrecy. The kind of Westminster culture of secrecy that we inherited is still very much an issue in Jamaica, and I suspect other countries in the region. And as well, just the ongoing need for ongoing education of people in terms of how to use access to information. I mean, when I did the seminar in association with this project last year, August, it was a free seminar. I just sent it out and say, hey, come, I'm going to go through the act with you. I was amazed. We had senior journalists in the room asking all kinds of questions. We had people saying, hey, I've tried this, couldn't get any information. What can I do? And people reaching out for help to me afterwards, and were really very, very much appreciative. So I would say those are the issues.
Thanks so much, Dion. I want to move to civil society. Jeanette Cole is with us from JAMP, who I have a lot of respect and regard for because of the great work she's doing. And Jeanette, this is an issue that you believe in because I know you are very firm on the need for accountability and transparency. And I told you this morning before we started the formal session that I wish we could import you because you seem to have a blueprint, and we should be rolling that out regionally. But tell us a little bit about what you have been doing.
Well, thank you very much, Kiran. It's really been a great morning. No matter how I'm used to the process, listening to Dion, it just sounds fresh again. Thank you for that, Dion. It gave me a lot to chew on. And the report that MIC has done has really been incredible. But it also makes me proud, Kiran, because I have been able to go what I think is a good long way with our legislation in Jamaica that's not perfect, but I have really been impressed with what citizens have been able to do. I think it was last week, I was at the Ministry of Finance's procurement conference in Montego Bay, and I was asked to chair a session on the role of the citizen and the media in combating corruption, particularly in the public procurement area. And I refer to the Access to Information Act as a gift to the citizens of Jamaica from the government and the parliament, because that's how it feels. I can't think of anything that has been more empowering in terms of my need to know what's happening. So for those, just to set a little bit of context for the rest of my comments, I have a 5-year-old, almost 5-year-old civil society organization, as Kiran says, that's focused on accountability, not corruption. Corruption is just a subset of an accountability issue. We're looking at waste, mismanagement, and fraud. And to have a discussion on ATI, I have to tell you the window through which we do the work that we do, which depends heavily on the access to information framework. I think it was on Dion. I was being interviewed on Dion's evening program that looks on public affairs beyond the headlines. And I said, Dion, I finally framed my message. It is that we, the citizen, have to. Dion talked a while ago about the Westminster system and the mindset and the culture that we're coming out of. And it's not just in the public sector, it's the mindset that the citizen has as well. And I am convinced it has to be a change of our mindset first. And then we will see the mindset in government and parliament. They say power concedes nothing without a demand. So we have to place a demand on parliament and the government, but we have to be convinced first. And to me, the issue is, who am I? So I was sharing on Dion one evening that I am not just a citizen that tells me where I belong. I am more interested right now in what belongs to me. And here in Jamaica, I'm a part owner of 146, let's call them public companies, 12 executive agencies, and the ministries are out there doing work on my behalf. I am not just a voter, because voting is a signal to me that there's something I need to do once every 4 or 5 years, which is really a means to somebody else's end. I think voting is a mechanism by which citizens identify and hire 63 public officials every 4 to 5 years. And if I'm hiring someone, then they work for me. And if they work for me, Kiran, then I have a responsibility as an employer to monitor and to oversee. And if things are going wrong with my employees and I'm not accessing the information I need, then I'm not so sure the problem is them. I have to look at, what am I doing? And last but by no means least is the issue of money. I don't like being called a taxpayer because I don't like to pay taxes, but that was again a wrong mindset. I am financing the entire machinery of government. I am an investor. And the minute I began to look at it for what it is, my mindset had a shift, because if I'm investing and I'm financing, then I want a return on my investment. So the whole ATI framework became alive for me, because in order for me to be a good employer, I need information about what my employees doing. And if you're financing, if you're investing in stocks and shares, you can bet your bottom dollar that folks aren't just checking in once every 5 years the way we do when election comes. They're checking in to see how the shares are doing. They're going to the annual general meetings. They're asking questions. They're getting information to insist that they get the expected return. So it's that mindset change that we have had that makes ATI crucial, because I'm just going to do a quick share screen here, just to give those that are watching an idea of what we've been able to do. Has it come up?
Yes.
Thank you. What we've been able to do as a result of Jamaica's ATI, we've had success and we've had challenges. We've digitized Jamaica's national budget. But I'm really happy to be able to say that the Ministry of Finance has been one of the most responsive of all the entities that have been engaging since 2016. JAM was launched in 2019. But it was testing the ATI model in Jamaica from 2016 and recognizing that, hold on a minute, I'm getting responses. That made me realize that a portal such as this, where we create digital tools for citizens to operate in that mindset I told you, as employer and as financier and as, I forget the other one, owner, right? So these became 6 tools, not just for citizens. It's being drawn on not as much as I'd like as yet by parliamentarians, but it is being used by the anti-corruption agencies. And I was very delighted the other day to hear that some donor agencies are actually using the budget tool to assess what Jamaica is doing. The Ministry of Finance in Jamaica provided us with a soft copy, just as an example, of their budget at a level of minutiae that had never been shared before. So here in Jamaica, if you go into our tool and put in the word cow, you'd be able to tell Kiran how much we're going to spend on cows. If you put in Armored Security Service, you'll know exactly what is being spent on that. And there are many thousands of applications for that tool, from the businessman to the parliamentarian to the citizen. The MP tracker is just tracking certain accountability metrics about our parliamentarians. The accountometer is tracking the things that you could say go wrong. So we're getting Auditor General reports about waste, about breaches in governments to the laws, particularly the financial laws. I just going to apply the brakes here and just say the first ATI I sent was on that. The question was to a permanent secretary. And I asked, what documentation do you have to substantiate what steps you have taken to remedy this breach? And I told her what the breach was and where it could be found. And to my surprise, Kiran, when we first ran that test, I sent out 236 access to information requests to permanent secretaries to follow up on Auditor General reports. And within 2 months, we had a 44% turnaround. That was in 2016. In a culture where a very senior civil society advocate told me, Jeanette, you probably wouldn't get one. So we have moved from 44% in 2016. We're now over 80% in terms of the responses that we get here in 2024. And the last, a procurement tracker. Dion talked about, I think the term was active transparency. Here it was, I thought, because contracting and procurement is so dear to my heart. This is how government provides goods and services, and I wanted to go to the best person at the best price at the right time. I thought, we should have a database on how public money flows from government to the private sector, only to discover that this database existed for 14 years in Jamaica, and I had no idea. So that's the other thing, Kiran, where information is provided, but it's out there in the open. And at the same time, it's not out there in the open. But having found it, was able to convert that into a data visualization tool that anti-corruption agencies, the media, and civil society can utilize. The legislative tracker, and last is an ATI request tool itself. And this was just the need to make it super easy. Dion told you about even journalists that grapple. You can imagine citizens. So what we've done is digitize the process. So citizens don't have a list of all the ATI officers, who they are, what their email address is. So we built a database. All they need to know is who in government they have a question for. And once they select the entity, it sends out that email, one to the person asking the requester, one to the entity that needs to respond. They both now have copies of each other's email and they can continue the process. So we haven't done what MIC is doing, which is fine because help is needed. We don't want to duplicate it. What we did was just create a tool to make it easier. But if they have a problem after that, the tools built by MIC would be able to help. The hurdles that we have had, team, have not been that much. I think it has been more successful for JAMP. But the one, if I were to pick the biggest one of them all, it's a simple, tiny oversight, and it's about the difference between wanting information and information that is documented. There are things that I've been asking the government for, and as long as it is not documented and they can't point to it on a piece of paper, I can't get a response to it, and some of it is quite ridiculous. I'll close by, because there'll be more for me to say as we go in, but I'll just close with an example. Accountability 101. We are going to be funding the biggest budget Jamaica's had so far. It's over $1 trillion. And one of the things we thought is, here we're building accountability tools. Why aren't we finding out what are the big ticket items the government has promised? And then at the end of the financial year, finding out how have they done. So we ran this 2 years ago and we thought it went well with 108 commitments. We're doing it again this year. And in the process, I wrote in and asked, just as an example, government has committed to helping 7,500 students on path. How much of that 75,000 students were helped and how much did it cost? Now, I'm sure an answer can be given if nothing has been done. But if nothing has been done, and it means there is 0 reports and 0 paper, the answer we get is there is no documentation available. Now, if I'm asking about the status, you could really just tell me that nothing has been achieved. But these are ways in which the law demanding that the information I need is documented has created a difficulty, because sometimes I believe government has information, even though it's not on paper. And quickly, I must say this one, the Constituency Development Fund in Jamaica, we have 63 constituencies. We have 20 million Jamaican dollars allocated every year to each constituency. And I've been trying since, I think, the last 4 years to just get a report from our parliamentarians on how did you steward the $20 million? And under Jamaica's legislation, I'm not able to leverage it for this particular request because the legislation speaks to what? It speaks to needing information from an authority. And I go down the list and I look at all of those things as in an entity, an institution. And I go down the list and I can't find anything that matches a person, a parliamentarian, and they generate these reports. I have had that as a big block. So mostly successful for us here at JAM to be able to do what we're doing, and we're adding 2 more tools before the year is out. But as we go through the discussion, I'd love to share some more what some of the challenges are. But at the end of the day, Kiran, if we can do this, there is a lot that if other citizens, I would say even 1% of the population using the ATI would really make a world of a difficulty. We have far more in Jamaica to be encouraged by and to encourage the other islands in terms of what we've been able to do.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. And I think that, you raised some important points there, that there is information, but we don't even know. And how do we get that information? How do we access it? How do we make use of it? And then what is missing that we need more of? So I would like to go to Toby Mendel. Toby, thank you for making the time for us. I know that you have a fan in Dion. You have a fan in me and many of us here. And yeah, you have a little cheerleading club here in the Caribbean because you've done such exceptional work for so many years on this. I want to ask you, from your experience, having looked at this throughout the world, and it's a difficult question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I think you're the only one who might have the answer. What do we do to help advance the process to have strong legislation in our countries?
Okay, that is a tough question. Let me first start by saying that by our standards, and I'm based in Nova Scotia, Canada, it's also a nice day here, but I'm not sure that most of you would agree with that because the temperature is 5 degrees, but at least it's sunny. So a little cooler than probably you're all experiencing. Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough question, and I don't think there's any one path, one size fits all on that one. And I mean, I just want to maybe say a little bit about some of the work I'm doing now. And I was chatting with Wesley. My next mission is to Micronesia. So, and I mean, some of the Caribbean states are small, but some of the states over there are really, really tiny. 3 of the 5 countries in Micronesia are less than 20,000 people. So I think, for small island developing states, which is the UN term for those kinds of states, we do need to think about some different approaches. And I mean, Dion talked a little bit about that. These countries, they don't have a lot of resources to draft legislation, but they also don't have a lot of resources to implement legislation. So I'm working with UNESCO, and we've done quite a bit of thinking about how to adapt these laws, because we have the standard, the Article 19 principles. My organization has developed what we call the RTI rating, the Right to Information rating. We have 61 indicators that we use to assess the strength of legislation, and those are standard across the whole world, and we've assessed all of the national laws in the world, and we'll endorse Dion's criticism of Guyana. It's very weak on the RTI rating, so I think that's a fairly objective assessment. But sometimes for really small island states, those standards are not always going to be realistic, both on the legislative side, but also when you come to implementation. So we have made like a number of recommendations there. And I think that if you if you make it more realistic for very small population states, maybe it'll be easier to convince them to adopt legislation. And that's, certainly what we're hoping in the Pacific. And I mean, just to give a couple of our recommendations, and for example, I mean, we've always advocated that every public authority should have an information officer. So when you approach the public authority, there's a person there that's responsible for processing your request, and you know where to make the request, and that person is supposed to move it along. So the Department of Education or the Ministry of Health or whatever, each one of them has that person. But what we have seen is that that's not realistic. If your whole state is 20,000 people, that's you're not going to have 30 information officers in the 30 different government departments. I mean, that's just not a realistic thing. And what we actually have here in Nova Scotia, even though we're about 1 million people in this province, we have just one central location where you lodge all of the requests for information. So you don't approach the public authority, you approach the central unit. It's I forget the name of it, but the Information Services Unit or something like that. And so, that's easy for the citizen because it's the same place, the same email address, the same people. They can train those people really well because all they do is work on access to information. Whereas if you're a small government department that receives 10 requests a year, I mean, how much training can you provide to the person that's responsible for that? It's not realistic to provide intense training to somebody to process 10 requests a year. But if these are specialized people doing just that. So I'm just giving that as one example. So I think that we, as we're going forward, we're starting to think more and more, I mean, globally, about how to adapt both legislation and implementation protocols so that, small states, I mean, I don't know what a small state is. There's no kind of, definition exactly, but let's say below 1 million people, they have more effective means for that. And I hope that this report, I mean, the report is oriented towards the Pacific, but to be honest, the recommendations are relevant to anywhere, and I hope that becomes public fairly soon. I mean, obviously, advocacy, and I mean, trying to get as many different players on board with that advocacy, because we often talk about government. I mean, those of us in civil society talk about government as though it's this monolith, but you often find champions of RTI or ATI within government, people within government who actually believe in openness. It's good to get them on board. You very often find legislators, members of parliament who can be on board. And it's a little bit more work, but if you can find champions within the business community, I think that's also really, really important. And I mean, I'm not mentioning here the obvious candidates, the journalist community, the civil society community, citizens' rights groups. I mean, those people, are always core to any campaign around access to information, but bringing in some of these other kind of players, the sort of the non-usual suspects, if I may, I think can be quite important. And of course, I mean, so the first piece was about trying to facilitate for countries that are struggling, helping them draft the legislation. Many of the people in the Pacific that we're talking to, they say, well, yes, sure, we absolutely support this and we would like to have this, but I mean, we just don't know about this issue. We don't know how to do it. We don't have the resources for that. So I think, providing support is one thing, strengthening the advocacy is another one. And by advocacy, I mean essentially advocacy from people within the country, but then of course international support and pressure is another part of the piece, and UNESCO and the World Bank and other international actors can provide that support. And I think trying to kind of find the sweet spot of bringing that all together is quite can be difficult, but if you manage it, that can be quite a successful strategy. If I may, I'd just like to say a couple of words about the amendment issue. And I mean, Dion is absolutely right to warn us that amendment is not, it's not a one-way street. Many times governments love to amend their access to information legislation because they find it to be a pain in the you-know-what, and they want to take that away from us. I did a report. It's actually quite an old report now, and I haven't updated it. So it was published in 2011, looking exactly at that issue, what had happened in the amendment space. And for example, Ireland, which had unfortunate amendments, was one of the countries that we looked at, but among many others. But one of the interesting things we found, well, two interesting things we found. Firstly, was that far more often amendments were positive than negative. So amendments improved the legislation. So, and that, I mean, my impression as a civil society activist was, we're always fighting against negative government moves in this area, but actually the evidence showed that, by and large amendments were positive. But also we found in quite a few cases that governments were sought to introduce negative amendments, and then that's the exactly, thank you. And then civil society groups and journalists and society mobilized against that, and that the end result was an improvement in the legislation. So what started out as a government attempt to reduce the scope of this right actually ended up in a positive way. So sometimes the facts can surprise you a little bit. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. But I really, I mean, on this sort of small island piece that we're doing, I mean, I think that's really, really important to think practically how, for small states, we can make this realistic, because, it's not a lot of point to pass a, gold star piece of legislation only to find that it's not realistic to implement it, or that it just doesn't get implemented.
So Toby, on that note, because you have this experience with almost every country in the world, whose legislation you think is the best when it comes to FOI and ATI?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two ways to answer that question. And one, I mentioned, the RTI rating that we have, and we have, it's a very objective, very scientific tool for assessing legislation. And by the way, when I was mentioning in the chat about the work we did on Suriname, it was an RTI rating of the draft legislation for Suriname. And, anyone can go onto the website and look at that. And I mean, if you do, you will see the best country in the world for access to information is Afghanistan, which may seem a little surprising to people. Afghanistan in 2018, Afghanistan passed a law in 2014. It amended that law in 2018. I worked very closely with the Afghan government at that time to improve the legislation, and they did all the right things. And furthermore, I used to get a lot of, even back then, I used to get a lot of kind of negative, Afghanistan, blah, blah, blah. And I always pushed back on that really strongly, because the government was committed to it. And I mean, of course, implementation wasn't perfect. I mean, the government didn't control half of the country, apart from anything else, but they really were committed to it, and they were actually moving forward quite impressively. I think they, credit where it was due. Of course, now with the Taliban running Afghanistan, it's not the case now. And I mean, but they have not actually changed the legislation, and the RTI rating only looks at the legislation. And then you can look, Mexico is the second strongest, and you can kind of walk down the RTI rating. And just to mention, I mean, you have some very, very strong performers in the Caribbean. St. Kitts and Nevis sitting on 116 out of 150. 150 points would be like a perfect law. 116 is a really, really strong score. It puts St. Kitts and Nevis in 17th place from among the 140 countries with legislation. Antigua and Barbuda, 113 points in 20th place. So, I mean, you have some, really strong examples in your region. But if to take a slightly more holistic view of that question, looking at legislation, but also strong implementation, I would have said, until maybe the last 5 years, I would have really highlighted Mexico, which is the second strongest legislation, but which also has a really, really strong system of implementation, and India, which is in the top 10, I think it's 9th now, but also had a really, really strong record on implementation. But both of those countries have taken fairly strong attacks on their system recently. In Mexico, I don't know if people are aware, but the government tried to kill the oversight body by not appointing members. So the oversight body is supposed to have 7 members, and it needs 5 members to have quorum. And the government simply didn't appoint members. So they actually fell to 4 members. So they were unable to conduct business, and they had to go to court, and the court gave them a special ruling to say that they could still conduct business with the 4 members, even though it wasn't quorum. So, I mean, you can, even countries that are doing really well, you can see, backsliding, unfortunately. And I think we really need to look not only at the legislation, and I mean, I would, advise people to look at the ATI rating. It's I'll drop the link in the chat. It'll show you the legislation, and if you want like legislative drafting, I think that's a great place to go. The model laws, by the way, the OAS model law, I think is like 146 or 143 out of 150 points. So, I mean, it's incredibly strong, but I mean, nobody has that law. Whereas these laws are laws that are there. But you just need to keep fighting for implementation continuously. Thanks, Jeanette. Because if you don't, government will start to undermine it. It's just, I mean, Dion kind of said that in her remarks as well. If you don't continuously watch and keep on to government and don't let them take anything away, because if you don't do that, they will try. But the top countries there is, you can look at them, and that's those are, in terms of the actual wording of legislation, I would recommend some of them, because they showcase different ways to do the things that Dion talked a lot about, different ways to do that in great ways, in great legislative ways.
Thanks for that, Toby. I'm going to come to Wesley, but Wesley, before I come to you, I know we have 70 people in the room, and by show of hands, folks, how many of you here are journalists? If you could just use the reaction button, raise hand button, to indicate how many of you here are journalists, I would appreciate it. I have a reason for this. It's a good reason. If you all could continue. How many are journalists? Just raise your hand, please. I'm gonna give you all another 10 seconds. Okay. So keep your hands raised. Now I'm gonna do a follow-up question. How many of you, so we have 17 is showing, how many, 18, okay, couple of latecomers, late hand raisers, as it would be, 18. How many of you have done some kind of article or talk show or blog with regards to freedom of information and access to information and the importance of it to the public? So let's see how many hands go down. So if you haven't done that, just lower your hand for me. So of the hands that are up, you all have done some form of reporting on the importance of freedom of information or access to information, yes? 10. So basically, we lost about half of those who are journalists. Well, we're down to 9 now. And the reason I make that point is because everybody here this morning so far has spoken about advocacy and the significance of it. And I think we need to realize that if we want to make a difference, we really have to keep this issue on the front burner because it affects everyone. And Jeanette could not have said it better. You are not just a taxpayer, you are an investor. The public are all investors. And with that, Wes, I want to come to you because we have been seeing an increase globally of misinformation and disinformation. We are coming into a very heavy election cycle in our region. I think it's 7 to 8 countries in our region who will be holding elections in 2025. I think ATI is the one I have as 7 or 8. We don't know what will happen there yet. How important is freedom of and access to information with regards to the issue of mis and disinformation to you?
Well, the simple answer to that would be absolutely important. But I wanted to get to the core question of access to information law, because I think we're dealing with several things. One is the hardware or infrastructure to access it for public access to publicly held information. And we're talking about the software of it, which has to do with socio-cultural antecedents. And I think it was Dion who spoke about the culture of secrecy and attributing it to Westminster-style government, the whole fact of our colonial past, etc. So these are factors to consider. Now, in FOBI's best practice list, at the very top of the table, if you're coming back to this question of infrastructure and hardware versus software, I mean, all of us, the top countries that he identified are highly problematic countries. Mexico is also known for its very strong press freedom legislation and freedom of expression legislation. But it's also one of the leading countries where journalists are attacked and killed, kidnapped, and otherwise silenced. So I think we need to make that distinction, because it's not always a matter of what is in the law or what the law says. And this is why one of my central concerns on this question of access to information are the sort of socio-cultural antecedents that govern, and Janet made the point, that govern how all of us operate, both as civil society and as governments, as officialdom, and as average everyday citizens. I think we need to place heavier emphasis on that. However important the legislation is, however important the frameworks for governing our society are, we need as public-minded citizens, as professionals, to pay greater attention to that. So those people who may not have raised their hand when it came to this question of writing about access to information in a very active way, I'm pretty sure their hand would have remained up if they had ever written, if you had asked a question about had they written pieces expressing concern about the absence of enthusiasm on the part of officialdom and other public entities to request by average everyday citizens to information that can change their lives. A lot of the presentations before, and I must confess that I feel a little bit like a tail ender here. Toby probably wouldn't understand the allusion, but in the game of cricket, there's this concept of the tail ender, who is the guy who comes last and is not really expected to contribute very much. But at the same time,
sometimes wins the game, Wesley.
Tail enders have also scored the winning run on many occasions. But it's not that I feel slighted in any way, because the presentations that preceded mine are very wholesome, and I think get to the core of some of the points that I had originally intended to make, which is this whole matter of the culture of secrecy. And Dion raised it, and she scooped me on that point, because there is this pervasive culture of secrecy, but even more so a culture that in which the default is prohibition as opposed to greater access or more freedom. And that's why I take her admonition regarding the amendment situation very seriously, because in the Caribbean, anytime governments have this temptation to tinker with law, the default always tends to be, for whatever reason, colonial past, whatever, anytime they tinker, and you look at the sum, the net effect of it, it always somehow or the other arrive amongst to something that's more prohibitive. And if they do not tinker with core legislation, for example, our access to information laws, and Toby, I take your information very seriously here. It might well be that in tinkering, you end up strengthening, but what are you doing with the other hand? So Jamaica, for example, freedom, access to information legislation that's perhaps the most widely used in the Caribbean. I know other than Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica really is a front runner, and Jeanette's testimony on that, strengthens my view on this, which is Jamaica legislation does permit a lot and provides a lot of leeway for accessing publicly held information. But while you have that, what the right hand is doing is tinkering with the official secrets legislation. I mean, it seems incongruous that you would have legislation on the one part that's saying, okay, we want to free up and we want to open, while at the same time, and seeping in through the other door is official secrets legislation, data protection legislation, most of which are having the impact of imposing further restrictions, further prohibitions, legislation to counter disinformation and misinformation. That was the question Iran asked, which would have to do with cybercrime and cyber legislation. We are seeing the emergence of cyber legislation through which is seeping the re-emergence of issues that we thought had disappeared through enlightened engagement of access to information laws. So I think we have to pay attention, keep our eyes perpetually, not only on the frameworks and the infrastructure that's there to facilitate these things, and Toby is perfectly correct. We have to understand the cultural environment. We have to understand the limitations on with respect to small size and resources, while at the same time we can openly condemn what's happening in Guyana in terms of the abuse of the Office of the Commissioner of Information, and the fact that the legislation there is woefully inadequate by not taking the extra steps. While we bear that in mind, we need to also bear in mind that as small societies with a predisposition towards prohibition and silence are not necessarily being open about things, that we need to weigh those things in the overall conversation. I really want to pay high tribute to the work of Dion and the technical team that worked on this, because I think that the report captures some of these elements, that it does not pass legislation as a cold, hard steel and brick structure, but it takes into account some of those things, those matters of what I continue to call the software, the thing that's going to give meaning to the legislation. As journalists, we know the deal very well. We know the deal. The default is the answer no. The default is to provide as little information as possible, notwithstanding the fact that our countries have publicly endorsed global measures to open things more. Toby would be aware of the work done on the SDGs. I mean, within GFMD, we had major actors like Toby and others who advocated for strengthening of the SDGs such that you would have provisions for access to information. So to target 1610, for example, which is a very often forgotten one, which has been endorsed by all our governments. They've had the photo ops, they've had the press conferences, they've put out the press releases, and yet they all seem to have forgotten that target 1610 makes very, very specific mention of the requirement of all governments that have signed onto the SDGs to conduct themselves in a far more open and accountable manner. We have the Escazú Agreement, and Dion, I know, is very strong on advocacy for this, where most, not all, I believe Trinidad and Tobago is yet to sign on to the Escazú Agreement. I might be mistaken, but the majority of our Caribbean countries have signed on to the Escazú Agreement, which relates to environmental information. And if you live and work in the Caribbean, you would see that environmental information is sort of base information that determines a whole lot of other principles and other features of how our societies work in such a way that they perhaps constitute one of the most important areas of concern for our countries. So the fact of the matter is that, yes, legislation, stronger and more enlightened legislation, but at the same time, we need to pay attention to some of these sociocultural conditions that guide the way we operate as societies. The public servant, yes, is following the public service regulations, which have not been amended to comply entirely with our access to information laws. But at the same time, the public servant is an average everyday citizen who does not really, really, truly believe that everybody needs to know as much as possible about everything, particularly those things that are held in trust for us by public agencies. And so that's, to me, that's the fact of the matter. That's the stark reality we have to confront in all of this. And I think that, you know, all of the speakers before me have covered some of these points in their own way. And one final point, which is that, and I'm glad that Dion, and it's contemplated in the report, with respect to the changing information environment. Most of our governments, at least nominally, at least publicly, are speaking of digitalization of governance processes. How does that relate now to the current environment? And we see that there's a lot of resistance. My newspaper column tomorrow addresses this issue of the slow pace of the digitalization effort, which also has to do with some of the psychosocial and cultural conditions that exist. There is this strong resistance by key sectors in our countries. Key sectors, it's not only governments, but even within the private sector, to pursue meaningful digitalization of their processes in such a manner that would make the whole accessing of information that's meaningful to people much simpler in the current technological environment. We need to keep our eyes on that, because access to digital information is really what we're going to be speaking about in the not too distant future. Well, that of course depends on how quickly our countries move, and we're moving far too slowly in terms of embracing the new digital reality. So I can stop there, and perhaps people will have questions to ask.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, but I would like to thank everyone here, and I want to jump quickly to one question that came up. Dion, is really for you. Will the Access to Information Act of Jamaica be impacted by the Data Protection Act? It's the same question that I have, because in Trinidad we have the same problem, and I'm sure in the rest of the region we will.
Yeah, I said Jeanette has dropped a story from the Gleaner in the group, in fact, in which one of our investigative journalists trying to get some information on government contracts was told that information can't be released because it's breaching the Data Protection Act. He spoke to me about it, and I'm actually working on a position paper on it now. So I don't want to get into the legalities of it until I really look at it. I know that it was a concern we had, and I also know that the impression that was given was that no, that wouldn't in fact impact the kind of publicly available information. But, you know, governments do what governments do. And as Wesley was saying, the default position is to say, no, you can't get something. And I think the Data Protection Act is, we've already seen from this one instance, and I can see it being used as another obstacle to prevent us getting information. But like I say, I want to do an actually informed position on it so that we can, when we speak on the issue, we can come from a position of a little bit of authority.
Can I just add a word on that, Kieran?
Sure, yes, of course.
Yes, so I mean, privacy, data protection laws protect privacy, and privacy is another human right. And there should be no conflict between access to information laws and data protection laws. Privacy is an exception in all of the access to information laws, and the data protection laws should spell out what the scope of that. That said, sometimes the data protection laws are overprotective of privacy. They protect too broad a range, and they don't, for example, recognize the public interest override that Dion talked about, which is crucially important. Where rights conflict, it doesn't mean that one just beats the other one. There's a balancing of which interest is more important, and that's exactly what the public interest override is, where the access to information interest is greater than the privacy interest, it should prevail. Not that privacy always wins. But there's also another issue, and I don't know whether the example that Dion mentioned or that perhaps is in the Gleaner story mentioned, but that's the public officials' perception of what's private versus what's really private, which are not, can be worlds apart. A contract, if you get a government contract, then, it's not private. I mean, your address, if your address is on the contract, then that's a private element that can be taken out. But the basic contract, as Jeanette well said, these are our investments, and we're overseeing the use of our money, and that's not a private matter. This is a public matter that that my money is being spent to build something for me. So we get all kinds of ridiculous claims, even here in Canada, but around the world, about privacy that are just completely illegitimate, and that you have to, because the public officials are standing on that, you have to go through to the oversight body, the Information Commission, or even if you don't have one of those, you have to go to court to beat that. So it's, I mean, the power balance under these laws, even if the officials are coming with completely ridiculous excuses for not giving out information, and privacy is an excellent excuse because it's vague and people don't really know what it is, then it can procedurally create a lot of problems for you. So even if the law doesn't conflict, that doesn't mean that that right can't be used to undermine access to information.
Thanks for that, Toby. Folks, we have to wrap, but I just wanted to say that the reason why we have done this is because we started this process by informing you all of FOI and ATI in the region, what it means, what the obstacles are. We did that with a panel discussion. It's up on our YouTube channel, the series we did in January of last year. We followed that up with the help desk, which is still open and available to everyone, not just journalists. You do not have to have legislation in your country to utilize that tool. Please use it, because it helps us too, as organizations, MIC, ACM, and the local press associations, to be able to see what is happening, right? And to be able to help you get the information we need. And we followed through now with this report, right, and an advocacy toolkit, because at the end of the day, we can't all just sit back and allow the things to happen, and we do not take a vested approach with it. The way I go back to what Janet said, with JAMP, and we have to do that. We all have to be very invested. So you have all of the tools. You have everything before you. There's no reason why collectively we cannot take this process forward to reach some kind of compromise or some kind of agreement with the powers that be. But I think it needs all of us to be involved. It can't be one person championing. We have to be involved, and media and civil society organizations are very, very significant partners on this journey. So I urge everyone to please pick up the mantle, pick up the torch, whatever you want to pick up, but let's go forward now that we have all of the tools we need. I'm a radio person. Typical radio commercial is 30 seconds. I want to move around the room here with our panelists, and in 30 seconds, what is your wish or desire with regards to FOI and ATI in our region? What's your wish? Leon, I'll start with you.
That we use the laws more.
10 seconds. I love you. You could be on radio 24/7. Jeanette.
That we connect the dots for citizens, for them to realize how practical and the difference it can make to the quality of their lives if they start to use it.
Thank you. Toby?
That we get 100% coverage of all of the countries in the region having ATI laws.
Thank you. Wesley?
Well, Toby stole mine, but yes, that all CARICOM countries follow, and that they all follow a similar model legislation.
Okay, and this is not the end, Wesley. I'm glad that you wrapped that, because that was one of the intentions of MIC at the start, and we are going to be working with our ACM partners, and anybody who wants to join the march, we'll be working with you all to move this forward. Thank you, guys. You all have stayed on. I remind everyone, if you've not yet registered for the Caribbean Media Summit, to please do so. Registration is almost closed, but you have a little time, and I'll leave you with a little sneak peek of what will happen in the Caribbean next week at Caramac.
Thank you very much, folks.
So if you haven't registered yet, please register. We have colleagues from around the world joining us virtually and some in person for what will be a mega event. So it's hybrid, limited spaces still in person, and everybody else online. And it is free. So let's hope we can keep it like that next year as well. Thank you, guys. Thank you again, panelists. Very excited. And
sorry to interrupt you, Kieran, but somebody is asking, when will the report be available? I know it's published now, but perhaps they want to know how to get it.
We'll be sending a link to the report to everyone after this, after today. So you will get it by this evening. Please check your emails and you will have a copy of the report. Okay, folks, thank you all. And if I don't see you all in advance, happy World Press Freedom Day. That's coming up soon. And I wish you all well. Take care, everybody. Bye.